Hi Algebra 2, this is Mrs. Cowles, and today we're going to take a look at solving quadratic equations by factoring and square rooting. Our objective today is to use the method of factoring and solving by square roots to solve a quadratic equation. So let's review. We've been looking at quadratic equations in standard form, which is written as ax squared plus bx plus c set equal to 0, where our coefficient a can never be equal to 0. The zero product property says anytime you have a product of two numbers, a times b, it will always be equal to 0 if either a equals 0 or b equals 0. We are going to use this rule to help us solve quadratic equations today by factoring. So you need to learn the steps of how to solve by factoring, and there are 5 of them, so it's important that you sit down and learn them. So the first one is, anytime you're going to solve a quadratic by factoring, is you have to write it in standard form. Standard form, again, is of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals to 0. Set it equal to 0. Once you have it in standard form set equal to 0, you're going to factor the quadratic expression. Then you're going to use the zero product property, solve it for x. When we are solving for x, we're finding the zeros of the parabola. We're finding where our quadratic equation, the parabola, when we graph it, would cross the x-axis. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at this first example. So when I look at number 1a, I have x squared minus 8x equals negative 12. Now, it is not written in standard form. We need to get the negative 12 moved to the other side, so we're going to do that by adding a positive 12 to both sides. When we add the positive 12, we are going to end up with x squared minus 8x plus 12, and we set that equal to 0. Step 1 is done. We have it in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c set equal to 0. Now step 2 is to factor. So we take a look here. Since our a term is 1, all we need to do is we need to think about what's going to multiply to 12 and add to negative 8. So what are the factors of positive 12 that are going to sum to negative 8? And when we think about that, it's going to be negative 6 and negative 2. For those of you that use that x method, you would go ahead and you could just put this in and say it's going to be negative 6 and negative 2. So we will write this as x minus 6 and x minus 2. And we're going to set that equal to 0. Now we use the zero product property. We will set x minus 6 equal to 0, and we will also set x minus 2 equal to 0. And we will solve each one of those for x. And when we go through and solve, the first one is going to set x is equal to positive 6. The second one will have x is equal to positive 2. So we have found 2 solutions to our question, and you should always go back and plug them in to make sure that they work. We're going to just double check. Does 6 squared minus 8 times 6 equal negative 12? That's 36 minus 48. Does that equal negative 12? And when we plug it back in, we can see that it checks. We should check, does it work for the second one, for x equals 2? So we'll check it by doing 2 squared minus 8 times 2. Does that equal negative 12? Is 4 minus 16 equal to negative 12? Yes, it is, so it checks. Okay, so it's always a good idea to check your answer. So we have 2 places where our parabola is going to cross the x-axis. These are x-intercepts at x equals 6 and x equals 12. Sometimes they will call them the zeros. Sometimes they will call these the roots or the intercepts. Roots, zeros, and intercepts are all interchangeable, and that's what we have found by solving this quadratic. Let's continue on to the second one. So same thing. You can pause the video and try it on your own to see how you do, or you can continue to follow along. So we're going to take a look here, and we got to get it into standard form. So we're going to start by subtracting 6 from both sides. So we're going to have 2x squared plus 4x minus 6 equals 0. Now we're going to factor the quadratic. Now again, we take a look here. We have a greatest common factor that we need to pull out of every term. We can take a 2 out of each one of these. So we are going to be left with 2 times x squared plus 2x minus 3, and we're going to set that equal to 0. Now we're going to go ahead and factor the quadratic that's in parentheses. Once again, we see our a term is 1, and we want to think about what is going to multiply to negative 3? What is the product to get negative 3? That will add to a positive 2. So the factors that multiply to negative 3 and add to 2 are going to be positive 3 and negative 1. So because, again, my A term is 1, we can bring our 2 down out in front. We just bring that down, and this is going to factor into x plus 3 and x minus 1, and we set that equal to 0. Now, using our zero product property, we know that one of these factors here will have to be equal to 0. So we figure out when x plus 3 will equal 0, and that one will be when x is equal to negative 3. And then we're going to go ahead and set when x minus 1 is equal to 0, and that is going to be when x is equal to positive 1. We solve each of those equations. And again, you should check your answer, go through and plug them back in. And for time's sake, I have already checked them. They do work. But you guys should be always do that on a test. Make sure you did them correctly. And we have 2 points at which this parabola would cross our x-axis at negative 3 and positive 1. Let's go ahead and let's try the last one. So once again, we're going to go ahead and we're going to put that into standard form. So we have 16x squared. Again, when writing this in standard form, I always recommend that you keep the a term positive. So we're going to go ahead and subtract the 8x from both sides. 16x squared minus 8x equals 0. Now we're going to factor this. We have a GCF that we can factor out of each term. So we can take a look and factor an 8x out of each one of these. So we're going to put 8x is equal to 2x, and that's going to become a minus 1 and set that equal to 0. Now we will take each of our factors, 8x, and set it equal to 0, and we will set 2x minus 1 equal to 0. So we are going to go through and solve that, obviously dividing both sides by 8. We're going to find that x will be equal to 0 for the first one, and then we're going to go ahead and add 1 to both sides, and we get 2x is equal to 1, and we divide that by 2, and we're going to find x is equal to half. So we have 2 places where our graph will be crossing our x-axis at x equals 0 and x equals half. All right, so let's take a look at the next page. Another method for solving a quadratic is to solve by square rooting. And these are the steps. The first step is to rewrite it where you have the quadratic term ax squared set equal to your constant c. Then you're going to solve for x squared. To do this, we got to get rid of the times a, so we're going to divide both sides by a. And then the last step will be to take the square root of both sides. And remember, when solving for a square root, we have a positive and a negative answer. So we want to remember that we are going to take both the positive and negative sign with our answer, so we write it as a plus minus. Okay, so let's take a look at example 2. So I want you to solve this equation by finding the square roots. So what we're going to do is we find our quadratic term, 4x squared, and we're going to get that alone. So to get rid of the minus 25, we're going to add the 25 to both sides. So we have 4x squared equals 25. Now we're going to divide both sides by 4. Now I know a lot of you are going to want to divide this out in your calculator, but just leave it as a fraction for right now. We have 25 over 4. Now, to solve for x squared, all we have to do is get rid of the squaring function by taking the square root. When we have a fraction, you take a square root of both the top and the bottom, the numerator and the denominator. Remember, when solving for squaring, we want to include the positive and negative square root, so we put that plus and minus sign in our answer. The square root of 25 is 5, the square root of 4 is 2, so we have 2 roots. The first one is at positive 5 over 2, the second one is at negative 5 over 2. We continue on with the next one. We have 3x squared equals 48. We're going to solve that. To get the x squared all by itself, we're going to divide both sides by 3. X squared is equal to 16. We now go through and we are going to take the square root, and we're going to find that x is equal to plus or minus 4. This parabola, when we would graph it, would cross the x-axis at positive 4 and negative 4. So its roots are plus and minus 4, or its intercepts are plus and minus 4, its solutions are plus and minus 4, and I think that's roots, intercepts. So I'm trying to think of all the terms that we can call them, but there is a lot of interchangeable terms. So again, we want to get familiar with all of them. All right, so try the next one. Get rid of the minus 1/4. We're going to do that by adding 1/4 to both sides. x squared is equal to 1/4. Now again, we have the fraction, that's okay, let's just leave it. We're going to take the square root of both the numerator and the denominator. X is equal to plus or minus 1/2. All right, so now let's go ahead and let's apply these skills in a context problem. A smoke jumper jumps from 1,400 feet. The function describing the height is y equals negative 16t squared plus 1,400, where y is the height in feet and t is the time in seconds. So I'm actually going to go through, I'm going to highlight that function. And it tells us that y is the height in feet and t is the time in seconds. It's always important to note what your variables are representing. We're going to use factoring to find the time which the jumper is in free fall if the parachute opens at 1,000 feet. So the question tells us that they want us to use factoring to find the time. So if we're going to use factoring to find the time, that means we're looking for our t value when the parachute opens at 1,000 feet. 1,000 feet will be our height, that's going to be our y value. So we're going to take a look at two ways we can do this. We'll start with factoring. So we're going to take the 1,000 feet and we are going to plug it in for our y value, our height. So we're going to have 1,000 is equal to negative 16t squared plus 1,400. Now, to solve by factoring, that means we need to get it in standard form, meaning that we have to have the quadratic set equal to 0. Right now it's set equal to 1,000, so what we're going to do is we are going to subtract 1,000 from both sides. So we're going to go ahead and subtract 1,000, and we are going to end up with 0 equals negative 16t squared. 1,400 minus 1,000 becomes 400. Now, to solve by factoring, we're going to look for greatest common factor, and I know between 16 and 400 that 16 is a factor, and I'm actually going to factor out a negative 16 because I always like my lead term to be positive. So if 0 equals negative 16, and we're going to be left with t squared minus 25. Now, we have learned how do we factor t squared minus 25. This is the difference of two squares. To factor t squared minus 25 when it's a difference of squares, I take the square root of each one. The square root of t squared is t. The square root of 25 is 5. So this is going to factor into negative 16, and I would put a t plus 5 and a t minus 5. So now to solve that, we're going to take each of our factors, t plus 5, and set it equal to 0, and t minus 5, and set it equal to 0. When I go through and solve, I get t is equal to negative 5 seconds, or we have t is equal to positive 5 seconds. Now, because of the fact that it is talking about time, we are going to cross out the negative 5, and we are going to choose the positive 5 seconds for our answer. That is how you would solve this using factoring. Now we could also take the same problem and we could solve it using our square root method. So if we take a look here, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put the 1,000 in for our height, negative 16t squared plus 1,400. So to solve by square rooting, our goal is to get this quadratic term alone. So we're going to get rid of the 1,400. So we're going to subtract 1,400 from both sides. And when we do that, we are going to be left with negative 400 is equal to negative 16t squared. Now we have the quadratic term all alone. We're going to go ahead and get rid of the coefficient in front by dividing both sides by negative 16. When we divide that out, we are left with 25 is equal to t squared. We now take the square root of both sides, and we remember when solving for square rooting, we have to include both a positive and negative answer. And because our context is time, we are going to choose that t is equal to 5 seconds for our answer. And there you go. There are some examples for how to solve quadratic equations by factoring and by taking the square root. You should go through now and make a short summary of the steps that you need to help you better understand this and to finalize and solidify the concepts that were being taught today. Have a good night, Algebra 2.